So I got this movement project file open here. It's like one of the last tunes I put out with Never Say Die, besides the Space Laces remix. I'm going to be going over a lot of the mid-bass stuff, kind of sound design tips, some layering stuff, some go-to processing I've been doing. And yeah, we can jump right into it. I actually just found the first version of this patch, which is the main layer. And there's a lot of kind of mental boxes I check off when I'm layering, and one of them is to have really good mono compatibility on the main layer. So it'll be like super, just like right in the middle. A lot of low mids on this one because I was going for something like crunchier like that. And then we have a lot of supporting layers, but let's get right into the sound design for this. So I made this in Serum, and you can see we have some post-processing going on here, which I'll get into, but it's a fairly simple patch. It's the ICANN has kick wavetable. It looks like I have some sort of like a wavetable edit on there because it looks kind of like quantized almost, but in this case, I was looking for like a really like low mid vocodey sound, so I really like this table for stuff like that, and I use the bend minus to bend it all the way up. So we have about 5 modulations going on each LFO here. I use this first one as a sort of a push-pull. This is kind of like the level or the timbre of the the dynamics of the sound. You know, this is going to be on things that are going to be pushing the sound to the front of the mix and bringing it back in. So we can get a lot of rhythm just by messing with different timings with this. I like to have these two separated because then I can kind of do a lot of different timbre stuff on the second one, because getting into the second LFO, it's almost all just for things that are going to affect the tone of the sound. You can see I have it on the chorus. There's not even a lot of effects going on here. It's a fairly simple sound. A lot of it's coming from the high pass resonance and the notch here. So I kind of find a sweet spot like that with the resonance and really build the tone off of that usually. So once I have this set up, I like to resample it to audio. I do a whole nother batch of processing to get it really thick. A lot of OTT, a bit of erosion to make up for the missing top end. You know, like I was saying, I want a really strong fundamental mid-range. So a lot of this post-processing is actually what's making it sit so well in the mix. So as you can see, if we were to, I'll show you guys exactly kind of how I will resample stuff to audio just to make sure I'm bypassing any processing on the group or the master and like processing the signal twice. I actually want it to just sound exactly what it sounds when I have it soloed. So I just get the input directly in. You can see there's a lot of channels on this project, so we're gonna have to search for 36 vocodey long comp. And another thing I want to touch on while I'm reading like the goofy names for my things, like I like to rename everything I do with the word comp in it and then save it to my library. So if I Command F and hit comp here, this is like just a never-ending bank, and it's always growing. Every time I write a sound, you know, I make a sound and fully process it. You know, I save it as a rack like this. This is something I like really drive home to people I teach and just anyone asking for advice is to do stuff like this. It's gonna help you drive your sound home. You know, you're gonna kind of develop a sound that people will be able to recognize. And it just makes like creating future tracks a lot easier because you have a big bank of resources to pull from. So that's like one of the main things in my workflow. So back to the post-processing stuff. So we can actually remove this. I'm not using this corpus here, but sometimes I'll use that to get cool stereo effects. But yeah, it's just a phaser, like 30%. I like using this vocoder in Ableton, but I also don't want it to mess with the sub, so I made a rack here that's basically sending the sub through clean, or I have like a crossover here as everything below 200 hertz, and can show you guys how to do something like that really quick. So say we had just a stock vocoder and we only want this on the low end. You can actually hit Command G to group this stuff up. And then where we have this chain here, if we duplicate this, we're now gonna have 2 instances of the vocoder. And we can actually just set up like an EQ before the vocoder. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to delete that. So if we delete the vocoder on this bottom one, or the top one, this can be the low end, and this can be the vocoded layer. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. If you were to EQ here, boom, give it the old 200 hertz, and you can set up macros to adjust the cutoff accordingly, or you can just do it by EQing it like this. I basically just change this over to a high pass instead. So now we have only the signal 200 hertz and below 200 hertz and above going through the vocoder, which is good for getting a nice mid-range, but it won't like throw some crazy fuzz on your sub. I don't know, I feel like the vocoder fighting with the sub sometimes. So this rack and the OTT to make up a lot of the high end, and this is a really strong OTT, but you can hear without it. I'm actually, it's really a little less subtle than that, and then I have a big old meat rack there. It's some NASCO specials, a lot of trash and distortion and stuff. I can't really like give away any of his particular tutorial stuff. But yeah, once I get something set up like that, then I kind of start a workflow of kind of left to right, where I'll even have a little mini sound design session where I'll just keep bouncing different cuts of this bass and just kind of mess with the LFOs, because I set these up in a way that I can kind of get a lot of different variations just by messing with different positions with these knobs here. Like, so if we want to do like a faster bass here, and then kind of hear what that sounds like resampled in here. And we can go over some of the post-processing. I kind of touched on this earlier, but it's like a softer version of OTT here with it's not touching the highs at all, and some basic EQing and some saturation just to level it out at around 0. And I don't know why I put it up to 0.7 there. I do a lot of weird stuff in my mix downs. But yeah, let's check out how that would sound in the mix. So we get a cool little like layer just right off the bat messing with this, like the movement VIP. And yeah, I'll just kind of keep messing with this. And it takes a lot of time for me to get this sort of template sounding right, where I'm bouncing things to audio and they're sitting nice in the mix and all the post-processing is dialed in. But once I do, it's like I fly through the rest of the drop, because it's a lot of just guess and check and messing with the tone of the sound you're working on. And then I get into kind of like filling other spots in the stereo field and the spectrum with layering, which we can kind of touch on right now, because I feel like we've kind of done a good amount with this first layer here. So hopefully that was pretty helpful. So we have a lot of layering in this. As you can see, this bass group is absolutely massive. There's just like, at some points, like there's like, I think almost double-digit amount of layers going on here. So like I said before, I kind of have a bunch of boxes I'll check when I get into layering. That first one being getting a really good thick signal that you're going to kind of build around. And then I kind of start experimenting with a lot of the top end area, you know, like with glitchy, grainy kind of sounds. For this, I like to use texture warping, chorus, comb filters. I really like Crystallizer by Sound Toys, I believe it is who made that. And Crystallizer was the MVP in this project for sure. So we have like a saw wave layer there, and I'm just gonna like slowly start to introduce these while I'm soloing the main layer. Let's see if I can get this back to how it was. Like that, cool. So let's start bringing in some layers here. So we have this top saw wave kind of layer one, and then we have some more texture warpy stuff, I believe. So I took the same basses from before and just stretched them out on different textures. So I would use this ×2 knob over here, which actually will just stretch the audio double the length of what it was for you. If you go to texture mode and turn the flux all the way down and mess with the grain size, You can get a bunch of different tones out of that. This pairs really good with tonal delay and like heavy compression. So a lot of these layers sound like this by themselves. And another thing about layering to me is a lot of the stuff I solo and mess with just sounds extremely goofy. And then on top of the main sound, you kind of like, oh shit, like it kind of glues together, you know. Like that just sounds like hot garbage, but when you kind of bring it in on top of this main layer, you kind of see where it fits on top of this one as well. So it's really subtle, but when you take it out, you notice it a lot more than when it's just kind of chilling in there. A lot of these are just accents as well. Another tonal, like texture layer here. And then we have some more texture warping, some glitches. See, I have like huge batches of glitches. Like if I type in comp glitch, I can't type right now. These are just all like random bits of glitches I've made with Foley and a bunch of SFX I found on Splice. And I generally will take a bit of that and like stretch it and put effects on it and get kind of something like this. A lot of this stuff is already flattened, but I think I have some more layers going on over here. And then we can kind of show how I go about getting really good effects with Crystallizer, which is a very powerful tool for layering. See, I even chop up some like virtual riot bits sometimes, and just like get really hands-on with the post-processing. Trying to find a good little Crystallizer thing here. I can actually just demonstrate with this here. So I'm gonna bounce out the audio from 3710 here, which is the main bass. I'm sorry for the unorganization, guys. Sometimes like I just vomit sounds out and then mess with them for like 8 hours until I find some sort of motif or anything I can drive home. And I think that was the case in this song. So let's get the resampling directly from that main bass. Cool. So Crystallizer is really cool for layering stuff like this because you can actually, and what this is like it's like an echo granular synthesis. So basically if I'm doing a full parallel layer like this, I'd set the dry wet to completely wet because I'm going to blend this in as some weird messed up layer. And I like to turn off the MIDI sync and then just like mess with different values, like really short values. Change the pitch around. Sometimes I'll automate this. Sometimes I'll run this through a bandpass filter and compress it really, really heavily. Like how I was using the OTT before, I'll use it to kind of really emphasize the low mids and bring out the high end again. So we can have like a peak kind of cruising around like this. And I like to encourage people to get really, really weird with the processing on their layers because a lot of this stuff, if you're blending it in parallel, you can just get super crazy with. Like that, we lost all of this top end, as you can see. But we have a really strong peak in the mid-range. I usually will just use like a stock OTT at like max settings and just crank the output to get like really fat mids. Cool. And then we can even like stretch this further or mess with different settings in Crystallizer, but I kind of just bounce back and forth between having it soloed and hearing it with the main layer. And you never really notice until you unsolo it that you can like really fill the mix out, but I like to make sure that there's for sure not a lot of clashing frequencies on my layers, so I take into account that this has a lot of low mids, so I would keep this more as like just a top layer, have it sit on the side of the mix, maybe put like some simple delay to make it wide or just a utility to spread it out, stuff like that. So this is another cool trick I found in here. I like to do a lot of push and pull with my reverb. Like I never really keep my reverb static. I'm always kind of finding a way to manipulate it to be really present in the mix when I want it there, because reverb kind of sucks the like intensity out of a sound. It'll like bring it back in the mix. So I like to use it creatively and like in a transition, you know, and even in this case get hands-on with like flattening the reverb and then stretching it and reversing it into a sound. So this is something that can make your transitions just incredibly seamless. If there's a sound that's coming in on the next bar that sounds a little abrupt, sometimes you can take like a bit of the first hit and like flatten it and with some reverb and get like a tail, something like that. And you can even get crazier with stuff like this. You can see I'm doing this in a couple parts in the mix here. We can actually hear this in the mix, and then I'll turn it off and we'll see if it makes a good difference. So without it, let's unsolo that. It just doesn't have that like swing into that hit that it should, you know, and I find this drives my tracks really hard. And even in this case on this fill here, I believe I have some more reverb action flattened out there, so I can just really adjust it to be exactly as loud as I want, fade it to be exactly where it is in the mix. And it's one reason I work in audio, because I can do a lot of cool stuff like that, and using the Ableton fades is really helpful. Stuff like this, I actually had a reverb like this, and I just set an auto pan on it, which is a cool Ableton effect, which a lot of people use to send a signal like back and forth between the left and right in the stereo field. But if you set the phase to 0, you can actually just get amplitude modulation out of this. And sometimes I'll set this to a really fast value and kind of automate it to come up. And with reverb tail automation too, you can also get some cool like rhythmic stuff. A little too fast there. Let's try like 148. So that's kind of similar to what I did, but it was flattened before. Cool. Yeah, that's another really fun trick. Another thing that's really important in this track would be surrounding elements. So I'm going to turn off the mids group entirely here, and we can kind of get a sneak peek of what's going on like behind the scenes, you know? Like the basses obviously are the like lead focus of this track, but there's so much going on in the background that's driving it. Check, check, check. So there's a couple different vocal chants, a lot of cymbal layers. I like to have a lot of different layers, you know, and then like in this, like there's usually like a crash on the kick and snare, you know, just to really emphasize the high end on those. More like reversal stuff, you know, just to add that kind of dramatic swing into the like one of the phrasing, which is like the main part for me, is like getting that impact on the first kick or snare where the phrasing begins. And then I think what's really giving it a lot of kind of that evil feel is this, it's like a couple of strings, like minor seconds on top of each other. It's like the Psycho strings kind of, but just like really legato. And I believe before I flattened these, I had them super wide. So we should be able to see. Normally with something like this, I'll make sure it's like really heavily EQ'd. And I just get this sitting right on the sides of the mix, just enough so it's not, you know, fighting with the mid basses. But you can hear it's a pretty big difference when I turn it off. Especially in like these sections where there's a bit more room for stuff like that to cut through in the mix. Stuff like that. Vocal swells, brass stabs, little synth fillers. You know, I have little like risers like these. Stuff from my sample pack, which you guys should cop if you haven't already. It's on Splice. There's a lot of cool things like that. Like that's something directly from there that I'll just kind of toss in. Same with these. Really good fillers. A lot of times my track won't be hitting as hard as I need to, and I'll spend an hour or two kind of just messing with stuff like this, glass breaking, Foley, crowd noise, like whatever you can add. And as long as it's like kind of working with the flow of your mid basses, then you should be able to get a lot of intensity out of that.